I'm feeling unfamiliar with my body. I'm reflecting on something sad, but I think it'll go somewhere interesting. I have a friend, a teacher, who unfortunately was diagnosed with a horrible stage 4 cancer. And it's extremely strange to me to think of an otherwise healthy body and one of the healthiest minds I've ever met also having something growing in the most interesting part of himself that's also eating away at him. And in other ways, I'm thinking about my own body. There's this cold weather snap that's just come in. I have an old injury in my right toe. And my right toe was crushed by a sergeant at a volleyball game. I was playing volleyball with the Army. And as soon as the cold snap happened, I got this massive pain. And now every morning I have to crack it with my hand. I'm thinking about this and how other parts of ourselves start to feel alien after time and unfamiliar. I'm also thinking about the circumstances and how odd it feels to start wandering in a city with all these cracks and bumps.
I think it's really interesting how you talked about being unfamiliar with your own body. And you had mentioned specifically in relation to injuries, but I think that a lot of people can resonate with that thought even in other situations, whether it's unfamiliar because what you see in the mirror isn't what you'd like to see, or whether it's unfamiliar because things happen to your body that you just don't know what are happening.
Do you think it could ever be a therapeutic thing to not recognize yourself in the mirror?
Oh, yeah.
I think there could be some catharsis to it if there's something that you're trying to resolve, but I think there can also be a lot of dislike.
I think it would be kind of frightening because I would see it not just as your body, but what you put on your body. And to me, that has a lot to do with your personality. So if you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize your body, then you also wouldn't recognize your personality or yourself. And then what do you have left?
Yeah, but like, have you ever had that after a long day where you come back and for a second either you're like exhausted, tired, but you don't recognize yourself passing in the metro or in like a streetcar and oh wait, that's me.
I find it quite healing actually. I always find it very liberating.
It's interesting that you're very liberated by lacking, I don't want to say lacking a sense of self, but almost like being free of your sense of self.
It's
you know
true,
what I mean?
I've said that a lot of times.
Yeah. Personally, like, versus like, I'm, for example, someone who's very into my own body in a not self-narcissistic way, but rather like, I'm very into, you know, I have colored hair because I like to project my own thoughts onto my body, and I'm very protective of my body.
I think that not wanting to associate with myself doesn't make me unable to be familiar with my body as a process.
It just makes you maybe more comfortable when you're unfamiliar?
I think it makes me more curious, for one thing.
Have you ever forgotten you had dyed hair? And then...
I have. I frequently cut and dyed my hair, and it's taken me up to maybe a couple of weeks to finally realize, like, oh yes, this is how I look now. And it's always I want to say it's a fun process, but I think there's a degree of frightening to it too. Like the idea that something's changed and I haven't been able to quite put my finger on it.
Yeah, I had that feeling when I cut my hair really, really short. It was like down here, and then I cut it to here, and this is the process of it growing back. But for the first few times when I looked in the mirror, it was like, who the hell? And it was almost like, for a second, it was like kind of sad. It was like, oh, I've lost something. But then it was also, I really enjoyed the new hair.
I'm really interested by the fact that you use the words sad and the idea that you've lost something. That's a very interesting concept to me when we think about it in relation to like having a body. The idea that you can lose a part of yourself because you changed a physical part of yourself. I'm very into having a physical appearance that makes you feel comfortable with yourself. And it's very interesting to me when you're at odds with your own body.
A physical part of myself that I feel comfortable with is?
A physical part of myself that I feel comfortable with is my malleable face.
Stand up.
I'm someone who's very much into physical comedy and physical theater and being a comedian, and I found that having a very expressive face helps with that. Expressive. Having a very a face that is able to do many emotions.
Something that would help me to be a better comedian would be...
Something that would help me to be a better comedian would be experience. And I don't just mean like, doing stand-up, I mean like literal life experience.
You can sit back there.
I think the root of all comedy is shared experience.
Can you speak a little slower, please?
I think the root of all comedy is shared experience. We laugh at things we can relate to, or conversely, we laugh at things that are so outside the realm of possibility that we can't possibly relate to them. But I think ultimately, having the experience of them would make one. I think ultimately, having the experience of it would make it still easier to get there.
An experience I wish I could share with people to relate to them is.
An experience I wish I could share to relate to people. An experience I wish I could share to relate to people is, probably not a specific experience, but maybe just like fallen in love. Not something that's passed by my realm yet.
Falling in love.
Falling in love.
Falling.
Experiencing. Not something that's passed by my realm of experience yet, and something that, from what I've observed at least, happens to a lot of people. And it's not so much that I'm like eagerly seeking it out, but rather that I'm curious.
Something that hasn't passed by my experience yet, but that I would like to someday is.
Something that hasn't passed by my experience yet, but I would like to, is. Being deeply emotionally intimate with another person.
Intimate.
Being deeply emotionally vulnerable with another person. I use the word almost proudly. I'm a shallow person. I do a lot of surface level things. And it's not to say that I'm scared of being vulnerable, but rather that it just hasn't come up. I'm not very good at it. So I think that I would like that experience. I would like to be able to have a good cry with someone. Yeah. I'd like to be more emotionally available to the people around me.
What kind of love are we seeking? Is vulnerability somewhere other than at the surface?
Love sometimes built on a common experience.
What kind of love are we seeking, really? Is vulnerability somewhere other than just at the surface? Can we be good at vulnerability, or does vulnerability just happen to us?
Love sometimes built on having witnessed the same thing at the same time.
I felt nostalgic when you were talking about sharing intimacy with someone. Like a strange, sad happiness.
It reminds me of what we were just talking about, looking in the mirror and not recognizing myself. Sometimes when I feel like I'm falling in love, I feel that I don't recognize the person I'm looking at, and it could be anything.
Do you find that's because you go through an emotional change when you find you're relating to someone like that?
And maybe that's how I treat them. And maybe in love,
Recognition.
we become free.
Recognition.
I'm feeling heavy in thinking about that word.
You're feeling heavy about the word recognition?
Feeling heavy about the word recognition.
Is there a word that you would use instead?
Recognition is similar to familiarity, but
I'm feeling heavy by thinking of the word recognition.
not quite.
I feel guilty that I don't seem to have the same emotional response to that word. And I have to wonder if it's because I haven't had the same experiences of emotional vulnerability. You talked about falling in love, which is something I just mentioned I've never had in my realm.
I don't think you need to feel guilty. This may sound strange, but I'm feeling the need to love you a little more right now. And now I'm feeling like I love you a little more.
You love me a little more. I feel like I want to talk more about that vulnerability. I mentioned that vulnerability is something I didn't feel because I was a very shallow person. And I'd like to clarify about that it's not that vulnerability comes from a place of deepness, but rather that I don't think I can access it because I haven't been to that place of deepness.
Was it vulnerable when Leia tripped? Or was that something else?
Vulnerable for her or for others?
I don't know. Wait, sorry. I don't know.
Can vulnerability be decided for you?
I didn't feel very vulnerable when I tripped, but to be frank, I do it quite a lot.
Emotional vulnerability is something that's developed. The trip was an accident, right? Yeah?
Maybe it was vulnerable when I first started tripping and being awkward, but now that
Vulnerability
I've gotten used to
Could be
it,
an accident also.
I've developed pretty thick skin towards it.
I don't think
Thick
just because
skin.
something happens only once, it's not a process.
She has developed a thick skin.
It's like when I first started acting and having to be really vulnerable in front of a lot of people, it was very frightening at first, but now that I've been doing it for a few years, it's only sometimes frightening.
That's really interesting because when I act, I don't feel vulnerable.
I'm wondering about the relationship between thick skin and vulnerability and love. And if thinning of skin is also what happens when you fall in love. But I don't just mean romantic love, and I want to make it really clear that I'm not talking about romantic love because I feel that's one of the saddest things that's happened to us as people, is that we give ourselves so little space to love, so little time, so little opportunities to love. But I think that if we tripped more, maybe we would fall in love a little bit, but also with ourselves and just like, I don't know, just having little moments of like veil thinning.
Something else I think would help with falling in love is
Something else I think with falling in love is something else I think would help with falling in love is
What's a story relating to a time you felt about romantic love?
time I fell in non-romantic love. Oh, not to be too circular, but I think it's also those times when I don't recognize myself in the mirror. I hope that's not vague.
recognize.
Identify with myself in the mirror. And then whatever it is that's in the mirror becomes something else other than me, and maybe it's a little easier to love it when it's like that. But also because as a self, you're always already another. So I suppose that makes it a little more real. Maybe love is a little more real. I feel like thanking everyone for your time.
Not recognizing myself is usually a cold feeling, and I feel warm when you talk about losing yourself.
It's also really scary. I've also had really terrifying, horrible experiences where I don't recognize myself, and I look at my hands and they don't feel like mine, and that's pretty shitty.
The part I find terrifying about not recognizing myself is
The part I find terrifying about not recognizing myself is more than just not having control, but it's about, I guess it's just about being really far away from myself. But also it's like the feeling I get when I'm far away from someone I love.
far away.
Separated from, distant from. Like there's a lot of distance between us.
would help close the distance is?
Something I wish would help close the distance is play. We were talking about bodies earlier and how you get to know your body, and I was thinking about that being a process of play, where if your body is a territory that you don't understand, it's full of
Can you speak louder?
it's full of faster. Can you speak faster? I can try to speak faster, and I'll try to speak faster now. And when I'm speaking faster now, I'll be saying things like what is coming out of my mouth right now, which are words, and these words mean things that I think about love, but they also don't mean many things because I'm also speaking because you're asking me to speak. And now I'm nervous. But I think that if we could approach our bodies as a territory of play, we could find out a lot more things about them.
I wish we could go into the specific stories that are bringing us to this lofty conversation. I wish I'd been there when we felt lost, each respectively. And I wish, while we were talking about all these lofty things, that we could sing a little more.
Play is a great way to find yourself.
I wish we could actually say the stories that are inspiring these things and express them in the way that we feel them. And I wish we'd been present for whatever wildness had occurred in our respective lives. And I wish we could make vibrations with our vocal boxes.
It's perfectly fine to use play as a method to recognizing yourself and finding yourself.
Why can't we tell those stories?
Because, at least for myself, I'm still feeling distant. Even though I'm having a lot of fun, and have had fun over the past few days with you guys.
Reminds me of that one time I said distant. Not that very distant to go.
I enjoyed that instant.
I feel interested by how we use the word distance in a lot of different ways to recognize the separation of ourselves in a concept.
I wish we could all come to this time.
I wish we didn't feel so distant all the time.
I wish I had the courage to be the first one to tell an intimate story in this space.
I wish being distant from certain things was more acceptable.
I really like that.
It reminds me a lot of, and it's interesting how we keep coming back to this, the idea of not recognizing yourself and being distant from yourself. It reminds me of that conversation because we often hear a lot about how our bodies are supposed to be our true selves in a way. Which, to clarify, I don't think is true.
Yeah, I tried to do a handstand for the first time in about a year and I couldn't do it anymore.
Did you feel disappointed with your body?
Yeah, and I wanted to make it work like it used to.
It reminds me of growing up, or growing older, and not being able to do things anymore.
I feel terrified at the idea of growing up and not being able to move or talk the way I do now.
You've been talking a lot about physical things like your body, but I also think it pertains also to mental and psychological things.
Oh, absolutely.
Like play.
Yeah, we start to occupy more physical space and we also accumulate more experiences but still feel limited.
It's also, you talk about occupying more physical space, which is something that I think a lot of us struggle with, the feeling of guilt I often feel guilty when I think I'm taking up too much space.
Me too!
I feel sad that that resonates with all of us.
I feel happy that it resonates with all of us. I feel sorry for saying that, but I also feel
No, it's fine.
I feel amused right
Your
now.
opinion's yours. But I'd like to clarify. When I talk about feeling guilty for occupying too much space, it's both in a physical sense. I feel, for example, I feel guilty when I have to use 2 bus seats because I've got a lot of bags. But also, I feel guilty emotionally when I take up too much space, when I'm being a burden.
I feel guilty for that too, and I also feel guilty for talking too much, whether I do or not.
Does anybody want to talk more than they are right now? Does anyone want to take up more space?
We'll take a pause while the players here write a monologue card of their choice, and while audience members with a dialogue piece of paper write a dialogue prompt of their choice. When the audience member has your prompt, you can go up on stage and hold your prompt up. There should just be 3 pieces of paper that audience members have. Yeah, one of whatever you want. Yeah, there's only 3 audience members that got pieces of paper at the beginning, and they're writing down new prompts that they're choosing, and when you're ready, they'll go up, and they will act as mic stands, holding up their prompts. Yeah. Can you just, lead in between the 2? Great. Yeah, just in between any of them. Great.
personal space you take up or how much personal space you're allowed to take up is something, is it cheating if I say room? How much room you take up?
Room.
I hate room. How much of yourself you allow to fill a space. I feel like that's something that you were taught as you're growing up, and whether it's like directly taught like by a parent or someone, or just something that you're taught through experiences. And I feel like it's different for, I'm gonna go there. I feel like it might be slightly different for people who are born male and people who are born female. Growing up as a female child, I was kind of told that I was like supposed to be seen and not heard. So I think that has a lot to do now with why I'm so uncomfortable speaking a lot. It's like I feel like I'm not, like I don't have the permission to do that.
I said, oof, I'm gonna go there because...
I said, oof, I'm gonna go there because the differences between the male experience and the female experience have been like talked about a lot in the past few years, and some people find that topic somewhat triggering, and some people find it a bit
A
boring.
way in which females are encouraged to take up less space is.
A way in which females are encouraged to take up less space is by, how do I phrase this? By like school uniforms is one way.
You can slow down.
And my thought process behind that is that at least in my school, you weren't allowed to show your shoulders. And so it's kind of like telling you that you're not allowed to show certain parts of yourself are wrong to show. And just by that, you're kind of like not allowed to take up that area. And I think that kind of is telling for a lot. Like there's a lot of things that are imposed in like modesty that kind of tells you that you're not supposed to be too loud, you're not supposed to.
Modesty.
How to behave properly.
Two.
How?
How one is supposed to behave. That still said two.
That's
How one is quote unquote supposed to behave.
A behavior I felt like I was supposed to do was.
A behavior I felt like I was supposed to do was listen while everybody else spoke. I also come from a very loud family, a very loud and opinionated family, and it was always kind of understood by me growing up that my job was like not to join in on conversations, but to listen to those conversations, and then like speak when you're spoken to. That was a big one.
Could you introduce yourself to us with the name you most prefer?
Hi, my name is Leia, like the princess. I also go by Luke, like the Jedi. Tis I.
A time I wish I had spoken with my family.
Really interesting. I never heard you introduce yourself that way before, but perhaps it was like the day that we did our introductions. But that's actually really beautiful, and I'm really happy that I got to hear that now. And it makes me reflect on the ways in which we've taken up and not taken up space in the past week that we've spent together.
Space.
Taken up intensity. Oh. Don't know why that came out, but I guess it's
Intensity.
intensity. Produced intensity. Produced something.
A time when I felt we have produced intensity or something was.
Did you say we or I?
I said we. But I were still.
A time when I feel that I produced intensity was, well, I was thinking about what you were saying in terms of clothing and the kind of clothing that you're wearing, and that like there's actual physical space on your body that is not supposed to be shown. And I was thinking of like times when I've shown more physical space on my body, and I think that produced some intensity, like good or bad or anything else. But I feel that that's also part of the reason why you're.
I feel like it's interesting that you almost, not quite, but you almost equated intensity with controversy in a way. The thing you were doing was radical, and because of that it was more intense, and in that way it was more, what was the word we used before intensity? Regardless, I think it's interesting that we view things that are controversial as almost more valuable, which is not quite the right word I'm looking for.
I think it's also a matter of not just the physical space, but like I for one have been having trouble after going home. There's so much to think about and process that we don't have time to necessarily discuss at the same time.
I'm going to start talking now because I stood up. And I stood up because I was confused. Vulnerability.
I've been confused as well. We've been discussing a lot of lofty things about like bodies and whatnot, and then going into stories that only you exclusively know.
Controversy, the reason that we find it to be more intense, I think might be because controversy is probably something that was deemed like taboo.
A time I did something taboo.
A time I did
Coming back to the idea of clothing is controversial when it's kind of just fabric on our bodies. And the idea that we put value onto this clothing. I think it's really interesting that the physical objects that we ascribe more worth to than others. No one cares whether or not I have a blue or red car, but everyone
I
cares.
ascribe worth to is
Something I ascribe worth to is
I feel like what's really happening here is that there's feelings that are happening combined with a lot of words that are happening.
I'm
And
feeling really
I feel
anxious
like
by the way
within
that
that,
this
there's
transition
just
happened.
a lot that we're just sort of like using words to introduce feelings and those
Aaron's
two are
coming on the
mixing
stage and
together.
talking now.
Yeah.
it's totally okay to feel anxious. Did everybody else experience some anxiousness at that moment?
Yes, I feel surprised.
I am in a constant state of anxiety.
How do you feel like that anxiety links to our discussion about vulnerability?
I feel anxious when I initially present myself as vulnerable. But over the years, I've developed a sort of wall to build up around it. So it's still there, I just have sort of this distance that I can put between and me. Yeah!
I'm appeasing
Yeah,
myself right now.
I agree with that.
I wasn't expecting that.
I wish I'd have been there for the rest of the week.
Back when I used to have that thing in my body before I let it out at the Express Somatically card, I felt
Back
really
when
helpful.
I used to be sitting there, I felt like I had a different relation to what was happening.
Felt a little more centered.
Back when we used to be just the four of us on stage, it felt a lot more intimate.
Back when it used to be just the four of us, I felt a lot more honest.
So I guess what's really happening is I'm interrupting, but wasn't I always interrupting you anyway? Because those are my rules that are here anyway.
Haley, could you go
We're
back
in
to
front of
your
an audience
comment
now.
about honesty?
Maybe I mean, since we keep talking about distance, maybe I felt closer to myself.
I wish you always felt closer to yourself.
That was just a hiccup.
Back when I used to want to agree with you and say, I also wish that I felt closer to myself, I remembered the conversation that we were just having about feeling closer to myself.
It's gonna be here because I feel surprised. Should I surprise?
I'm wondering what the living microphone stands are feeling right now.
I feel a wish that the audience members that are holding cards will activate them and say things.
But you don't have to.
Oh.
What?
That was really good.
Comes out. Yes.
I wonder though how you would be surprised, or how would you do surprise?
It feels slightly guilty that
That's
maybe
still
these
some
people
art.
didn't entirely know what they were getting into when they signed up for this.
I'm not surprised that I'm right in this spot right here, right now, with this thing that's a surprise.
Why aren't you surprised?
Because you get me always in these type of things. It's true.
That makes me feel really happy.
I feel more energized.
Back when I used to be sitting in the chair, I thought I was going to write climax on the card, but then I changed my mind.
I'm really glad that you did.
I wonder what would have happened if you had put climax.
I wish you hadn't.
Yeah, that's.
We're all picturing that right now.
I'm actually surprised of how the energy changed with us three starting to talk.
Oh, absolutely. I think having four more if we include Aaron, has definitely changed the whole vibe of it, especially since we've normally done rehearsals as only 4.
Back when I used to stand on the stage with just 3 other people talking, I felt so much more stressed out.
I feel confused by that.
I think that the people starting to talk allowed us to like diffuse some of our tension.
I wish the microphone
I'm surprised
stands
you had
themselves could
tension.
speak too.
I also wish the microphone stands themselves could speak
I wish
as
the
well.
throat could speak. What have you seen?
I wish everyone in the audience had a dialogue card that would just come out of their mouths.
Erin wishes that there was a dialogue card that would come out of your mouth. There are 8 people standing on the stage now. Nobody is talking except for me.
That's fine.
It's nice for teasing me.
Aaron's hunting.
People look worried.
The audience members are confused.
Maybe it's just me who's worried.
I'm
Starting to
surprised you
feel
can keep
slightly
this
stressed
going.
out that I have
Really surprised.
Back when it used
Aaron
to
is
be
making
just the
an
5
example
of us in rehearsal, I was always a little bit hesitant about how this part would work. And now I feel energized by the new energy in the room.
Do you feel that your hesitancy was appropriate?
I wish you could answer that.
feel a large amount of anger at this
What just happened?
Especially with the mic stand.
Mic stand, increasing dramatic tension.
Particularly the feeling.
I feel
I
humorous
felt really
how
happy
you
about that.
I feel
are
a little
so
bit.
I wish
Blasé
we could all
about it.
trip on the mic stands, but unintentionally.
So now I don't know how I'm feeling. And now I feel a little bit frustrated at Aaron for figuring down the
I wish we
corner.
started killing the mic
I
stands
feel
earlier.
joyful
I
that
wonder
you
why-
still find joy in that.
I wonder why I'm having a hard time
It's
formulating
funny.
emotions.
Closer to
I
colors.
wonder why I can't be questioned in the first place. As
I wish I'd
a
chosen a
I
different
feel
story.
overwhelmed by all the
I
things that are
wish my
happening.
shoes
Can
were
I hear
more.
everybody talking right now?
I wish my
So
soles
it's
were
like
not
a
really
little
humid.
excited like
I
this
wish
and
I
like
eaten a little more.
like
I wish I had more tea. I wish I could wear a skirt. I wish I had the courage to wear a skirt.
I can't hear anything.
Eating right now. I wish I was eating, wearing a skirt. I wish I had a big mug of tea.
Lights are really shining. Am I gonna fall down if I try to walk out of this room? Am I gonna throw someone? Am I gonna make it to the back? Am I gonna be okay? Am I gonna be okay?